The United States of America took another giant leap forward yesterday towards becoming a banana republic. The Labour Department reported an extremely weak jobs market, as you might have expected, given all the uncertainty around tariffs, all those raids to seize undocumented workers, and the wide-scale cuts to government agencies. President Trump's response? Well, sack the Labour statistics chief. Because sure, that's going to help. Tell the world that from now on, the economic data produced by the United States will be under the control of the same sort of slavish loyalists that populate the cabinet. That all figures will have been corrected to depict the world as the president would wish it to be. So then corporations and investors and anyone else looking to make a long-term decision with billions of dollars at stake, they will know that if they invest in the United States, they will be shooting in the dark, because the statistics will be as reliable as flipping a coin. So let's discuss. In the early months, after Trump started to disrupt the world and his own country with a whack-a-mole tariff policy, the initial preliminary figures were holding up pretty well, apparently. For all that some of us were saying, just hold off on leaping to judgment because the consequences of this sort of thing takes time to show up. Nevertheless, various people, and certainly the Trump administration itself, they were saying, see, look at the data. The American economy rocks. Trump's tariffs are the best thing ever. Yes, the president has abolished the laws of economics as well as the laws of physics and mathematics and anything else you can think of. Well, it is still early days, but we're now starting to see exactly some of the signs we would expect to be seeing if Trump had not successfully discredited the entire economics profession, as J.D. Vance at one point suggested. On Thursday, the Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that last month personal consumption expenditures rose at a higher than 3% annual rate, the third month in a row that it has written. It is the inflation measure that the Federal Reserve watches most closely, and they want it at around 2% or below. Then, the much more dramatic blow, the Bureau of Labour Statistics reported that job growth over the last 3 months has been a lot weaker than was previously believed. And this was particularly bad news for Trump because it sharply revised downwards previous preliminary figures that he had celebrated that suggested job growth in May and June had been holding up pretty well. Actually, the more accurate figures now show that it plummeted. The early figures for July were low, 73,000 jobs added, rather than the 115,000 that had been expected. But the figure for May, which had been 144,000, was slashed to 19,000. The one for June, previously 147,000, plunged to 14,000. Altogether, the figures show a decrease in new jobs of nearly 90%. If you break the figures down, most of the jobs that have been created are in the healthcare sector, one that is much less open to disruption from the tariff bingo we've been playing. Government jobs have shrunk, not grown, which is surely not a surprise to anyone really, given the savaging of government departments that have been taking place in recent months, courtesy of Doge. They were lowered by 119,000. But for all that Trump's tariffs are supposed to be leading to a domestic manufacturing boom, well, if that happens in the longer term, that remains to be seen. But in the shorter term, all the volatility and upset, all the sudden sharp increases in costs of inputs that have to be imported, this has correlated with a decline in manufacturing jobs on the market, as well as wholesale trade and retail trade jobs. So any standard economist looking at all of that, looking at the growth estimates that show a slowdown, they would conclude that the American economy, which was going pretty well when Trump came into office, it is now seriously slowing down. Lots of governments get to have to deal with bad economic news, of course. It's kind of a fact of life. Usually they seek to spin the figures to say that they're not so bad, and they've got a rationale with varying degrees of credibility as to why it's not so bad. And they talk about what they're going to do or what they are doing that will improve the figures in the future. They may even be right about that, or they may be kidding themselves. But all of that is standard political discourse. And in the earliest moments after the figures were released, we actually saw some of that sort of semblance of normality when the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisers, Stephen Moran, went onto CNBC to talk about the figures. He said much of the change was the result of quirks in the seasonal adjustment process. He admitted that some of it was the result of the president's own policies, particularly on immigration, which was potentially affecting hiring numbers for May and for June. In other words, the normal sort of political rationale. And with some basis in the figures, the foreign-born labour force in the US has shrunk by over 1.2 million in the last 6 months. And you can buy his explanations or you can reject them. But it shows it would have been entirely within the bounds of possibility for the Trump administration to say, yes, we're doing big things on immigration and tariffs, short-term pain for long-term gain. You know, that sort of thing. However, that of course is not the world that we live in. Indeed, President Trump threw a hissy fit, claimed that the data were rigged to make him look bad, and so he fired the Commissioner of the Bureau of Labour Statistics, Erica McIntyre. In a long rant on social media, he called her a Biden appointee, although she was voted in on a bipartisan basis, with even J.D. Vance amongst those who voted for her. McIntyre is a highly experienced economist, involved for many years in the production and analysis of government data. But as far as Trump was concerned, she was just a Biden appointee, and she had to be replaced with, quote, someone much more competent and qualified. Important to remember that the words used here, competent and qualified, should be taken from the 2025 authorised Trump dictionary definitions, which mean slavishly in line with the wishes of Donald J. Trump. Hilariously, Trump went on to say this: important numbers like this must be fair and accurate. They cannot be manipulated for political purposes. Obviously, there's no evidence they have been. Michael Strain, economist at the conservative American Enterprise Institute, said President Trump is completely wrong in asserting there's been any sort of anti-Trump bias in the labour market data. I think that assertion is wholly unsupported. Indeed, Trump has wanted it both ways on this. When the numbers were similarly, although not quite so dramatically, revised downwards under President Biden, Trump claimed the earlier figures had been rigged to be too high in order to make Biden look good. Now, the exact same process was apparently in order to make him look bad. But you cannot listen to the words that come out of this process with any expectation they're tied to a rational argument, which is going to establish any sort of principle that is then consistently applied. It is a stream of total garbage. It is whatever comes to mind that might make him look better in any given situation, regardless of how flimsy. No consistency, no rationale, just the latest orthodoxy to be consumed with a memory-wiping drug preferably, so yesterday's version that may have contradicted today's is no longer a problem. He went on to pronounce the orthodoxy of the day, so mere functionaries should not be in doubt. The economy is booming under Trump. One such functionary, Lori Chavez de Rima, the Labour Secretary, was quick to signal publicly that the message had been received and understood. She posted on Twitter, "I agree wholeheartedly with President Trump," so that's a shocker, "that our jobs numbers must be fair, accurate, and never manipulated for political purposes." Well, all of us agree with that, if we're using the old English dictionary definitions of all of those words. I support the president's decision to replace Biden's commissioner and ensure the American people can trust the important and influential data coming from the BLS. Because, sure, sacking the messenger, replacing them with someone more compliant, that is certain to increase trust in the figures. This is The Crossing. of an important line, because authoritarian nations, where bad news is never permitted to be shared publicly, they are famous for massaging the numbers. People have long debated, for instance, what the real growth figures, as well as the real pandemic figures and jobs figures and all the rest of it, would actually be for China over the last couple of decades. Everyone knew the official figures were plain wrong, so they looked to secondary data points, proxy indicators, to try to come up with a best guess, because that's all they could do. Well, congratulations, America. That's the brave new territory that you're fearlessly stepping towards. So David Wilcox, the former head of the Federal Economic Statistics Advisory Committee, he told the Financial Times that firing the commissioner would be, quote, a serious blow to the integrity of the US statistical system. It would raise questions amongst data users about whether the objective was to please the president or present the best possible picture of what's going on in the US economy. When you stand to make or lose serious money based on the actions you take in response to data, funnily enough, you start to care about the accuracy of that data more than you care about, for instance, Donald Trump's ego, precious and fragile though it may be. The group Friends of BLS, headed up by the two previous heads of the agency, said this: when leaders of other nations have politicized economic data and destroyed public trust in their data infrastructure, the consequences have been dire. The one bit of good news is that, in spite of the firing, flat-out massaging the future figures will probably turn out to be more difficult than they might anticipate, and even trying to do so would at least be noisy and would tip people off. Over 2,000 career professionals are engaged in collecting and analysing this data. It can't just easily be swapped out at the end of a process and nobody notices. Former head of the agency, William Beach, said that those 2,000 employees have a high degree of integrity on the quality of data they're working with, and have been able so far, including under the first Trump presidency, to carry out that work without political pressure. And he told the New York Times this: if that pressure got too great, you would see people resigning rather than shape the numbers. We will know more, of course, when we learn about who the replacement is going to be. If it is actually someone who is actually qualified and experienced, just from a more Republican-leaning background, well, that would be one thing. Kind of a tough gig for that person, bit of a thankless task. Not sure why anyone would take it on at this moment, but, maybe others see it differently, public service, all that. But if it's someone who is qualified because they believe Trump won the 2020 election and experienced in professing their loyalty to Trump in public, then we will have arrived at a moment when the US is plunging into that banana republic status. A glorious future where all Trump policies will be the most successful ever, because that's what the figures will show. Never mind the lying mainstream media pointing at evidence to the contrary, assuming those liars and cheaters haven't been abolished by then, replaced by more competent and qualified news outlets, no doubt. But it won't matter, because across the world, and within the United States as well, most people will realise, as they do about autocracies and indeed banana republics through history, they know that the numbers are lying. Once you've gotten to that point, and there's still a choice as to whether you get there, but it seems pretty clear the direction of travel, once you've got to that point, that's when democracies stop being democracies. They start just play acting democracies instead.